Hello, everyone. Welcome to EPA's 17th Annual Drinking Water Workshop. We are glad you could be here virtually with us today for webinar session 7A on Monitoring and Distribution Part 5, Methods and Analytics. If you have not done so already, please take a moment to respond to the poll on your screen. How many individuals are attending this webinar at your location? If there are more than 5 people in the room, please enter the number of attendees present in the questions box. We'll give you a few more seconds to respond. Thank you for your responses. Let's get started. If at any time during the webinar your screen does not load the next presenter's presentation, please try refreshing your browser. If that doesn't work, please try exiting full screen mode, or you can exit and rejoin the webinar. We're here to help, so at any time, feel free to use the questions box for any other technical issues. Now, let's hear from Greg Carroll, who will introduce our first speaker and help moderate the webinar.
Good morning and welcome, or I guess for many of you, welcome back to EPA's 17th Annual Drinking Water Workshop. We appreciate you joining us this morning for webinar session 7A on the topic of methods and analytics. My name is Greg Carroll, and I'm the director of the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water's Technical Support Center in Cincinnati. And as mentioned, I'll be serving as the moderator today. Before we get into it, maybe just a few logistical notes. If you're not already familiar, take a bit of time to familiarize yourself with the webinar panel on your screen. We do encourage you to ask questions for the speakers throughout the webinar by entering them in the question box. We are going to hold all of those questions until after our speakers have presented, and then at the end of the presentations, there's a block of time for a Q&A session where those will be covered. And a note, you can also use the question box if you're having any technical difficulties. So the presentations are available in the handouts on your GoToWebinar control panel, as well as in the link sent in the questions box. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in a few weeks at a link provided in the questions box. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll introduce our first speaker today. Chris Impellitteri will be speaking about PFAS analytical methods in water and in water-related samples. Chris serves as the Associate National Program Director for EPA's Office of Research and Development for their Safe and Sustainable Water Resources Research Program. He also leads EPA research on water treatment and infrastructure that focus on comprehensive water management that supports the EPA's program offices, regional offices, and state partners. So with that, I will turn things over to Chris.
Greg, can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes to both.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. We certainly miss having this event in person, that's for sure, and all the events that usually surround it, like the Reds game, but the way the Reds are playing right now, I don't know if anybody be going to that game anyway. Today, I'm going to give you an update on EPA analytical method development, and I'd like to recognize my colleagues, Mark Mills and Andy Gillespie. Those are just two colleagues, an army of people who are working on these methods and method development in general. So here is a disclaimer, and that disclaimer is essentially saying that anything I say today is my opinion or views are mine and not necessarily those of the agency itself. So there's the official stuff out of the way. First, just a little bit of background on PFAS themselves. You see here two of the, I guess, the most wanted, the poster children, if you will, of PFAS. That's PFOA on the left and PFOS on the right. Those are 8 carbon chain PFAS, so that's a backbone of carbons with varying degrees of fluorine substitutes on there. And there's a functional group on most, if not all, probably not all, but most PFAS. And that functional group will often determine some very important chemical characteristics. They are man-made. The chemistry can be quite complicated. We know of thousands of that exist in commerce. They're widely used in industrial processes and different products. And we recognize them as PBT, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. Not necessarily all of the PFAS, but many PFAS are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. A little bit about sampling up front. Generally, we recommend no Teflon, and we recommend no contact with clothes and materials that might contain PFAS. Things like food wrappers, things like water resistant or waterproof clothing that might be treated with PFAS to make them water resistant or waterproof. We have a newish PFAS analytical methods website with a lot of resources on it. That'll provide you links to a lot of the validated methods and some of the methods in development. We also included on that website sampling guidance from states. So for example, we've got sampling guidance documents from the state of Michigan, as well as, for example, the state of New Jersey. We also have a link to some guidance documents from the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council on site characterization and sampling. That last bullet there is a link to a fact sheet or a technical brief that covers some of the things that you want to look for when you have to review a PFAS data package. And that can be quite cumbersome because those data packages often include things like the raw chromatograms, a lot of raw calibration data and things like that. It's just a fact sheet to point you in the right direction when you're in the position of having to review some of these PFAS data packages. Over the next 3 slides, I'm going to take some time and I'm going to do some binning here. I'm going to throw some stuff into some different classifications. The first classification I'll use is targeted versus non-targeted methods. So targeted methods are methods that where you're looking for a specific analyte and it only sees that analyte on the targeted list. So it's only measuring what you tell the instrument to measure. Non-targeted methods, on the other hand, use high-resolution mass spectrometry to identify samples or identify PFAS compounds in a particular sample. Ideally, you want to quantitate those compounds that you discover with an existing standard, if that's possible. Some of the software in mass spectrometers these days will allow you to identify peaks and then again, hopefully confirm those peaks with some sort of standard. Here's kind of a cartoon describing this process. So the mass spectrometer, essentially, you got a peak from your readout. You can use software to calculate the exact number and the types of atoms needed to achieve that mass. Then you use the mass spec to break that compound apart, and then you analyze that product from that breaking process. Those two pieces of the puzzle can help a really well-experienced, well-trained analyst put the pieces of the puzzle back together to take a pretty good shot at identifying what that unknown is in the sample. And again, you want to compare that peak to a commercial standard when and where you can. This is not like the TV show CSI, right? So the instrument just doesn't spit you out. Okay, you got this is all the stuff in your sample. This is quite tedious and quite difficult process to do to identify unknowns in these samples, particularly as the samples get more complicated, such as wastewater influent and that kind of thing. So another classification I'm going to use here is standard methods. These are methods that have been through a formal multi-lab validation procedure, and they may follow a particular rulemaking or guidance effort, and they're available to support the agency in regulatory or guidance activities. And then we have what we refer to as research methods. So these are methods that have been developed in an ORD laboratory or an OW laboratory. They may have gone through QA and peer reviewed, but they have not been multi-lab validated, and they are not considered EPA standard methods. And then lastly, we're constantly working on developing methods and optimizing methods, and those are really those are really kind of the first step when we're first embarking on a mission to develop new methods. In a broader sense, for methods that throughout EPA, for methods that target solids and water, I'm not going to talk about air methods today. There are three broad categories. There's Safe Drinking Water Act methods, Clean Water Act methods, and solid waste SW846 methods. And there are links to all of those methods and method protocols there on this slide. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how a method is developed and validated through a particular category, you can go to those sites and learn a little bit more about that. I'm going to talk about all three categories, drinking water, Clean Water Act methods, and solid waste methods today. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the drinking water method 537. There was an originally the first revision on this added 4 compounds. Those are listed at as the first 4 sub-bullets at the top bullet. But that revision also incorporated some clarifications that were issued in an EPA technical advisory in between the original 537 and the revision. The final published method of the revision was in November 2018, and I believe there's been a second revision that really covered some editorial issues and things like that since then. But this method really gets down to sub-single nanogram per liter ranges for many of the compounds, and that those lowest concentration minimum reporting levels, the range are there at the bottom of this slide. One of the things we run into quite frequently is commercial labs or maybe even some state labs using a quote unquote modified 537 method. If these modifications are made and they are not within the scope of 537.1, then the method is not considered 537 by EPA. It doesn't matter if you tag a modified onto it or not. It has become your own lab's proprietary method. The most common modification is the inclusion of isotope dilution that we see. And I want to stress that there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with using a proprietary method. We just strongly prefer that it not be referred to as 537 modified. So in addition to 537, another drinking water method was developed over the past 2 years that does use solid phase extraction and isotope dilution and targets PFAS compound C12 and lower. This was done for a couple reasons. So method 537 generally performs poorly for the C4 compounds. As I mentioned, it's a solid phase extraction LCMS-MS isotope dilution method. The method will also allow EPA to consider additional PFAS for monitoring under the next unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. The method was released in December of 2019, and you can find a copy of that method at the link at the bottom of this slide. This is simply a table that compares the analytes that are included in 533 on the left-hand column, both methods in the middle column, and the analytes that are unique to 537.1 in the right-hand column. The analytes in bold there in the middle column were all listed on the third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. Now, moving on from drinking water, I'm going to talk a little bit about aqueous samples, but non-drinking water samples. So the first method that we validated was actually under the solid waste 846 protocols, and that method is 8327. It's a direct injection method, and it was multi-lab validated for groundwater, surface water, and wastewater influent. This method really looks to find a balance among sensitivity, ease of implementation and monitoring requirements. It's simple, it's robust, and it was really designed to maximize throughput for production lab use. Another advantage of this method is it really minimizes sample transfers, extractions, filter steps, and any chemical additions like pH adjustments, because any of those steps can introduce possible or potential contamination sources. A copy of this method can be found at that link at the bottom of this slide. It covers, and this is 8327 still, it covers 24 PFAS, all of the target analytes listed in method 537 for drinking water. It makes use of commercially available standards, both the native and the isotopically labeled compounds. It's, again, a direct injection method that was developed in EPA Region 5 in the Chicago Regional Lab. It's very similar to American Society for Testing and Materials, method D7979, because both of those methods were derived from the exact same Chicago Regional Lab standard operating procedure. The multi-lab validation study was completed back in 2018. The Office of Land and Emergency Management, or OLEM, is addressing public comments, which closed August 26, essentially closed last year, and they hope to finalize this by the end of September in 2020. It targets, the target quantitation limits for this method are 10 nanograms per liter or lower for all of the compounds. However, I will add that with some of the latest and the greatest instrumentation, and I don't want to name any specific vendors or specific units, but some of the advances that have been made over the past couple years in sample introduction and sample ionization can easily get us below 10 nanograms per liter and closer to 1 nanogram per liter for many of the compounds. There is an associated preparation method, 3512, for aqueous matrices, and that is found as an appendix in the current draft that you can access online. There's also a need for an isotope dilution method for non-drinking water samples. And isotope dilution is something that DoD, the Department of Defense, it feels rather strongly about, that they want included for any samples that are analyzed from a Department of Defense site. This is a more complex method relative to direct injection, but it will probably be more robust for really junky matrices, things like wastewater influence, biosolids, landfill leachates, because isotope dilution allows you to account for matrix effects, things like sorption, through tracking your isotope's standard recoveries throughout the analytical method. We are collaborating with the Department of Defense on this, and this method will afford options to make sure that we meet DoD requirements as they are outlined in DoD's table B15 Quality Systems Manual 5. Whatever version they're on right now, 5.1 something. It will also allow users or stakeholders to perform a deeper dive based on screening levels from something like 8327. Right now, we are up to 40 PFAS analytes. That includes all of the analytes listed in 537.1, 533, and 8327. We hope to build in flexibility with this method. So we realize that people are going to be using different columns, different types of elution schemes, and we are in a single laboratory validation progress in the Clean Water Act protocols. There's a single lab validation step first, and that's followed by a multi-lab validation. Again, it's a collaborative effort with Department of Defense, Office of Water, Office of Land and Emergency Management, and Office of Research and Development. Assuming that the single lab validation is a success, and we hope to have that data in and reviewed by the end of this calendar year, multi-lab validation will follow over the course of 2021. And the method is currently, as I mentioned, being developed in accordance with the Clean Water Act method protocols, but we are hoping that it may be adopted by the solid waste folks if they choose to do so once we get the data in for the Clean Water Act protocols. Target quantitation limits are between 1 and 10 nanograms per liter, and we are testing and validating a lot of matrices. This is somewhat of an unprecedented level of effort for a method validation. We're including wastewater influence and effluents, groundwater, surface water, landfill leachate, soil sediment, biosolids, and fish tissues as well. Just a little bit about some other waters that we're working on right now. So marine waters, we don't have an approved method for marine waters, but the method that we do use as a research grade or research level method utilizes isotope dilution. It covers 24 PFAS, those that are commercially in commercially available mixed standards, both the natives and the isotopes. Really, the challenge with marine waters is the matrix. So in dealing with high ionite strength and in some cases high dissolved organic matter, we have to use some concentration and cleanup steps to account for those more complicated matrices. This has been used not only in the analysis of sediments in marine waters, but also in a total organic precursor assay, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. If you're interested in learning more about the marine waters methods, there are contacts at the bottom of the slide that you can follow up with. As I mentioned, for the isotope dilution method that we're working to validate with DoD, which does include validation of fish tissue, we also have research grade fish tissue method. Again, there's no approved method yet for fish tissues. We are using commercial lab proprietary methods. And again, it involves solid phase extraction where you concentrate the sample and then the utilization of isotope dilution to quantify the compounds in that sample. The big challenge with fish tissues is dealing with fats and lipids in the tissues themselves. So there's a digestion process using some sort of caustic methanol solution, either potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, to release the PFAS from the tissue. And then you have to drop the solids out, deal with any excess fats and lipids through cleanup steps, and then process that cleaned up extract through solid phase extraction. In the work that we've been doing to date, longer chain PFAS tend to be the most persistent and present in fish fillets and whole fish. So PFAS that are carbon chain 8 and above. And again, there's a contact if you'd like to learn more about that at the bottom of this slide. Just a couple of slides about larger scale, perhaps for lack of a better way to put it, general methods. We're working on the development of a total organic fluorine or organofluorine analysis, or TOF. This uses instrumentation to absorb PFAS onto absorbents such as carbon. You combust it, you release the free fluorine ion, and you analyze the fluorine ion via ion chromatography. There's no particular specialized or costly instrumentation that's required. You can use it for aqueous matrices and things like blood samples. We're also going to be exploring whether or not we can use it for solid samples. The big challenge with this method is getting rid of the background inorganic fluorine from the sample, and that with some samples can be a really, really big challenge. It can be developed on a wide commercial scale, and this is a very high priority for us as well as for the Office of Water. To develop a draft method. We're aiming for 2020, but at this point, due to the pandemic, that will be most likely in 2021. Another kind of general broad measurement is total organic precursors. So this was developed by Houts et al. In Berkeley laboratories. There's no multi-laboratory validated standard method for total organic precursors. It is available from some contract laboratories, and it doesn't identify individual precursor compounds. It just gives you an idea of what the total amount of precursors you have in your sample are. So essentially, it is a little bit more expensive, well, double the price in some cases, because you have to analyze the same sample twice. You have to analyze it prior to oxidation, then you oxidize the sample in a pretty aggressive environment, and then you do a second measurement on what comes out of that oxidation process. You can use it for aqueous and solid matrices, and it gives you an estimate of the total concentration of PFAS precursors. And again, it's more expensive. It needs to be analyzed twice. So these precursors out in the environment, out in the real world, may be molecules that you're not even looking for in a targeted analysis. But after the oxidation step or after the transformation step, they become compounds that you can find with a targeted analysis. So in summary, we've got 2 drinking water methods that have been multi-validated and available for drinking water analyses. We have the direct injection method that's been multi-lab validated and hopefully will be finalized at the end of this month. And then we are continuing our single lab validation process for the isotope dilution method under the Clean Water Act for 40 PFAS. And then we continue to work on developing methods in the laboratory for fish tissues, serum, ambient air, which I haven't talked about at all, top and TOF, and then we also continue to develop standard operating procedures and applications for high-resolution mass spectrometry non-targeted analysis as well. Here's my contact information. Please do not hesitate to email me or give me a call if you have any questions about what I've presented today or anything else having to do with PFAS. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thanks, Chris. And again, we should have plenty of time at the end to cover questions. I see that at least one has come in through the chat box. We'll move ahead to our second presentation. Victoria Pretti will be talking about the history of the New York State Department of Health Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, or ELAP. Their program for PFOA and PFOS and the associated analytical methods. The ELAP program brought on the certification for these emerging contaminants in May of 2016. So Victoria is the Director and Quality Assurance Officer for New York's ELAP program. As a drinking water certification officer, she audits drinking water and bottled water facilities and laboratories. She supervises the program's team while managing the budget and has responsibility for approximately 500 certified laboratories. As a NELAC evaluator, she assesses other state environmental laboratory programs as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Victoria.
Well, welcome everyone, or good morning. There is no photo of me. I apologize, my webcam wasn't working, but we'll go from there. So I'm just coming from the viewpoint of how, a state responded to discovery of PFAS. So this is the history of, New York State Department of Health, response to these emergent contaminants, specifically PFOA and PFOS, and the methods that we opted to choose for certification. So it all started with Newburgh, New York, back in May 2015. PFAS contamination was found in the Newburgh area in the waters as part of a 2014 required annual water quality report. All samples were, below the EPA provisional level at that time. And if you want to learn more about that contamination, there is a whole write-up on the New York State DEC website. And then we have, following that contamination, we create a New York State water quality group in February 2016. So Governor Cuomo creates the Water Quality Rapid Response Team. This team works with the New York State Department of Health to confirm the presence of PFAS in the city of Newburgh in March. And then by May 2016, the EPA issued a revised health advisory. However, by that time, the city had already switched to a new source of water that was PFAS-free. And then we have village of Hoosick Falls, New York, in February 2016. PFOA was found in the village's private drinking water wells. PFOA levels were above the federal EPA health advisory's 70 parts per trillion. It was linked to past manufacturing sites in the area. Again, if you want to learn more about the actual, Hoosick event, you can go either to our Department of Health website at the link below, as well as the New York State DEC website. And then we have the program that I direct, the Department of Health Environmental Laboratory Approvals Program. So in June 2016, we're like, we have to start certifying for labs, because we knew it was part of the UCMR rule, yet we as a state have Public Health Law 502 that says, okay, we need to start testing using a certified lab, using approved vetted methods. So we start offering initially certification just for two parameters, PFOA, PFOS in the drinking water category by EPA method 537. And as the prior speaker alluded to, labs were playing with the method. So it was becoming EPA method 537 modified. We as New York State do not like the word modification. We will say it's a lab developed method and give certification to it. And I'll get into some of those methods that we approved in the future. So at the same time, we also set a required detection of 2 nanograms per liter for each of the analytes. By July 2016, ELAP offers certification for those two PFCs by ISO 25101, because this actually was a consensus method that offered isotope dilution. For us being a laboratory accreditation body, we hold labs to a method as written. So with this gave some flexibility of those labs who wanted to use isotope dilution. However, at the same time, we also released a frequently asked question and allowed for certain modifications when it came to preservation and sampling. And again, that's still posted on our website, and you can still find it by clicking the link below. And then comes July 2017 for our program. New York State Department of Health grants accreditation for laboratory approved programs. Again, this used inline solid phase extraction with your typical LC mass spec. The laboratory met all requirements of subpart 55 2.5, and it demonstrated the method's precision and accuracy was equivalent to or better than the approved consensus method. And typically when we ask labs to demonstrate, we ask them like for method modifications to get a lab developed method approved on the books by New York State, that they do a comparability study. And that comparability study usually requires them running samples in tandem at the lower level of calibration, mid-level, and high level, and doing percent recoveries. And then if they're working together, then we'll pretty much approve it. That is, the numbers are reflective that the recoveries are typically anywhere from 70 to 130. So New York State Department of Health, now in November 2018, we offer the 0.1. And as the prior speaker alluded to, it was just adding a few more PFC parameters. But again, New York State, we're still only offering certification for the 2 drinking water, PFOA, PFOS at this time. By May 2019, we have another lab who has created its own method, and this method uses direct injection. Again, it was able to demonstrate that its method, accuracy and performance were equivalent to or better than one of the approved EPA consensus methods. At the same time, anytime these labs do these lab developed methods, we also ensure that, they meet the required detection limits of 2 nanograms per liter, as I mentioned prior. So now we have July 2020, just a few months ago. we finally offer certification for EPA method 533. And this uses, solid phase extraction, liquid chromatography, tandem mass spec. At the same time, in July of 2020, Governor Cuomo announced the maximum contaminant level for these emerging contaminants, and that was at 10 parts per trillion. This is 7 times lower than the EPA limit established. And so summary of our approved labs. At present, we have about 11 labs certified for EPA 537. 4 labs are certified for the ISO method, although that's become obsolete, and most of the labs who are in the certified for either 537 or 537.1, we're going to most likely recommend them to just drop the certification for ISO method and take it off the books because it's rarely used. We have 2 labs certified for laboratory developed methods, and we have 2 labs for EPA 533. And just to note that, some labs hold multiple method certifications. So they might hold 537.1 along with EPA 533. And here's my contact information. Feel free to email me, look at our website, and thank you for your time. I will pass this on to the next speaker.
All right, thanks, Victoria. Before we move into the next speaker, I'll just clarify one point. I think earlier in between talks, I mentioned the chat box, and I just want to clarify, if you do have questions, you can find the dedicated question box in the tool panel. So with that, we'll move into our last presentation, and it's actually going to be a joint presentation on the subject of a method being developed by EPA to measure monochloramine in drinking water. So that presentation will be by Tom Waters and Matthew Alexander. Tom is with our Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water in Cincinnati, part of the Technical Support Center. He works on optimization approaches and provides technical assistance related to drinking water treatment and distribution systems, and has a particular focus on water treatment plant optimization to address cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins. And his previous work includes some hydraulic and hydrologic modeling and water resource studies. And then Matthew Alexander is also with our Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water Technical Support Center in Cincinnati, is also a member of the optimization program, where he supports the development and the demonstration of various optimization approaches, and he provides technical assistance related to disinfection byproducts, and distribution system water quality. So with that, I will turn it over to Matthew.
All right, thank you, Greg. Can you see my screen? Can you see me, and can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, well, I appreciate it. So good morning, everyone. So as Greg already described, Tom and I both work in the EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water in their Technical Support Center in Cincinnati. He also mentioned that both Tom and I typically work on the optimization program, or AWOP, otherwise known as. So this topic we're going to talk about today, it's kind of exciting because it's a little outside of the realm of what we typically work on. So we're excited to, sorry about that. So we're both excited to talk about this today. So what we're going to talk about is a new draft EPA method to determine monochloramine concentration in drinking water. I'd just like to point out that this method is still draft because although it's been developed and we went through the validation process, it's still under EPA review. It has not yet been published, and it has not yet been approved for compliance use yet. So it's still draft. I'd just like to point that out. But before I get started, I'd also like to point out the other authors on this project. Glenda Smith, who also works in TSC with Tom and I at Cincinnati. She doesn't work in the optimization program. Glenda works in the methods area, the ATP program and expedited method approval. So she's played a critical role in this project, just guiding Tom and I through the method development process. Although we have a lot of experience with chlorine analysis, monochloramine analysis, in both the lab and the field, Glenda's played a critical role in guiding us through this process. So we'd like to acknowledge her, as well as Dave Wamman. Dave has an extensive amount of research experience and expertise in chloramine chemistry, so he's played a critical role and just technical advice throughout the project as well. So just like to acknowledge our co-authors. And on to the next slide. So this is a standard EPA disclaimer. This has already been shown in multiple presentations this week, just like it was in Chris's. So I'm not going to go through and read this word for word, but it's here in the slide for your reference. So now I'm just going to give an overview of what Tom and I are going to talk about this morning. So I'm going to lead things off just giving a little background information, some motivation and rationale for why we pursue the development of this method. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who's showing that picture there, and he's going to talk about the method development process, talk about some of the validation study experiments. He's going to briefly talk about the method procedure. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about next steps of the method, and then we'll just wrap things up. So just for some background information, from a regulatory perspective, the surface water treatment rule requires a detectable disinfectant residual in the distribution system. So this can be measured as total chlorine, combined chlorine, or chlorine dioxide, as defined in 40 CFR 141.72. So just some definitions here. Total chlorine, it refers to the sum of free chlorine and combined chlorine. So it measures a variety of different types of disinfectant species. And then combined chlorine more specifically refers to monochloramine, dichloramine, and trichloramine. So an additional regulatory requirement is the stage 1 DBP rule, and that rule established MRDLs for both chlorine and chloramines at 4 milligrams per liter measured as CL2. And the reference for that is 40 CFR 141.65. But more importantly, in drinking water in terms of combined chlorine or chloramines, monochloramine is the predominant species based off typical pHs that water systems operate at, ranging from 7 to 9 or even above. Monochloramine is also the desired disinfectant because our understanding of its use as a disinfectant is much well understood. It's known to cause fewer taste and odor issues compared to di and trichloramine, and it's also relatively more stable. There is research out there that shows that dichloramine and trichloramines can be effective disinfectants. However, they're not as stable as monochloramine, and like I said, they're prone to more taste and odor issues. So monochloramine is definitely the desired species in terms of systems using chloramines. So now I'm going to switch gears and give a little background information about total chlorine analysis. So public water systems most commonly measure free or total chlorine using DPD colorimetric methods, which is standard methods 4500 CLG. Oftentimes, these measurements are collected in the field by distribution system operators using portable handheld colorimeters, just like the one that's shown in that photo there. So those are based on our experience. It's anecdotal, but these appear to be the most widely used instruments and methods in terms of quantifying disinfectant residual in water systems. So chloraminated systems, or systems that use chloramines as a secondary disinfectant, they typically measure total chlorine to comply with the surface water treatment rule and the stage 1 DBP rule. So the potential issue, though, with using this DPD reagent is that it'll readily react with not only chlorine, but also a variety of other oxidants in the water. So this could be bromine, chlorine dioxide, oxidized manganese, or a variety of other oxidants. So as a result of this undiscerning reactivity, this can result in overestimation of the effective disinfectant residual in the presence of other oxidants, So I'm saying the effective and also the desired disinfectant residual. So things like organochloramines, oxidized manganese, things like that can cause an overestimation, and that can be problematic. So I just discussed organochloramines. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it here. Basically, organochloramines form when chlorine reacts with dissolved organic nitrogen that's present in source water. So similar to dissolved organic carbon, background levels can vary from source to source. They can also vary seasonally. So because of this and a variety of other factors, the concentration or presence of organochloramines in source water can really vary. So like inorganic chloramines, that being monochloramine, dichloramine, and trichloramine, organochloramines have little to no disinfection efficacy. So in terms of disinfection strength, there's really none. They're also relatively more persistent compared to some of the inorganic chloramines, in particular monochloramine. So because of this issue, in terms of accurately quantifying a detectable residual in chloraminated distribution systems using the total chlorine DPD method, that can really become problematic. So this issue is pretty well known and it's been pretty well published or shared. In particular, the American Water Works Association had a disinfectant residual strategy panel about 5 years ago, and they sent a memo to EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water Director at that time, just stating this issue, just to bring more attention to it. Additionally, the EPA's 6-year review 3 DBP support document highlighted this issue, and it's also been discussed in various peer-reviewed publications. So hopefully you can see on the slide, I did include a couple of references that I'd strongly encourage you to look at if you want to learn more about this. The Lee et al. 2007 reference, it talks more about some of the methods used to quantify total chlorine residual as well as monochloramine residual, and it looks at some of the interferences from organochloramines. The Wamman and Pressman 2015 reference, it's more general and talks about the issue more broadly, especially in terms of some of the minimum residual requirements through various states throughout the country. The surface water treatment rule requires a detectable residual. However, some states have higher quantifiable minimum residual requirements. So that reference there is a good reference just to learn more about that. So also in this slide, I'm showing some data that we actually collected from a distribution system sampling study that we conducted about 10 years ago. Although this data is a little dated, it's still very relevant in illustrating this issue. So at a water system, we collected samples, water quality samples at a variety of locations. Just here in this table, I'm showing data from the treatment plant effluent, as well as a couple of distribution system locations. So site 1 is going to be more representative of an average distribution system location that we monitored at, and site 2 is going to be more representative of a maximum residence time location. So on this slide, we're showing total chlorine residual that we measured with the DPD total chlorine colorimetric method. The monochloramine measurements were collected with the Hawk monochloramine indophenol method. And then we're also just showing there to the far right column the difference between those two methods. So as you can see, the difference between the methods, it was relatively consistent throughout the system. It did decrease a little at the maximum residence time location, but it ranged from 0.44 to 0.3. But what I'd like to point out here is that site 2, which is more of an MRT site, in terms of the implications of that difference. So as I previously stated, some states have different minimum residual requirements. So let's just say hypothetically in this state, the minimum residual requirement was 0.2 milligrams per liter. So in this case, depending on what method they're using, they could either be in compliance or out of compliance. But in terms of public health protection, personally speaking, I prefer that to accurately quantify the effective disinfectant, which would be monochloramine, which we know that monochloramine method isn't as prone to those interferences, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. So this is a little background information about the Hawk monochloramine method. This method's been around for some period of time. It specifically measures monochloramine, unlike the DPD methods, which measures not only chlorine, but other oxidants. This one specifically measures monochloramine and isn't known to be affected by the presence of organochloramines or other oxidants. This commercially available method has been around for a while, but it wasn't around when EPA promulgated the surface water treatment rule. And currently, EPA has no requirement specifically to measure chloramine concentrations, more specifically monochloramine. So the patent did expire on this back in September of 2018. It's been around for about 20 years. It's been used quite a bit by chlorinated water systems for process control purposes. And it's also been pretty widely used in chloramine-related research as well. So the method's been around a while. The chemistry is pretty well understood. So it's not like it's a new chemistry that's just been introduced. So the fact that the patent had expired on this, there's a need or an interest in having an alternative method for quantifying disinfectant residual and chloramine systems, as previously stated, some of the motivation or rationale for that. We decided to pursue the development of an EPA monochloramine method. So what are some of the benefits for us doing that ourselves? Developing the method ourselves allowed us to incorporate some of the standard quality control and quality assurance elements that are typically included in EPA methods. Developing the method ourselves also allowed us to conduct the validation study ourselves. And by doing so, we actually came across a discrepancy between the method we had developed and the commercially available method from Hach. What we did find was a difference in reported sample reaction times or color development times for this colorimetric method. So based off what we learned in the lab, at temperatures of about 15 degrees C and below, what was reported in the manufacturer's commercially available method, the reaction times weren't sufficient to reach full color development. And this became a greater issue as temperatures decreased. So what does that mean? It can lead to low bias. So if you don't allow the sample to react long enough, you're gonna underreport what the actual disinfectant residual is. So through our method development work and the validation studies, we have corrected this issue. And Tom's gonna talk more about that in here in just a moment as we transition over to the other portion of this presentation. So I'm about ready to turn over to Tom, but I'd just like to highlight some of the things he's gonna talk about. He's gonna go through several of the validation study experiments that we conducted. In particular, the standard curve, the MDL experiments, the initial precision recovery, matrix spike interferences. And then he's going to talk in some detail about that discrepancy we found between the sample reaction time and color development times that were reported by Hach and then what we found. He's also going to talk about some of the quality control requirements with the method, and then he's going to turn it back over to me. I'm going to talk about the next steps we have planned. Then that will conclude our presentation, and we can wrap it up with some questions. So I'm going to transition to Tom. I'm going to mute my microphone, Tom, but you just tell me when to advance.
Okay, just a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So as Matt mentioned, I'm going to walk through some of the validation experiments that we conducted for this method. I will say, just to kick this off, Matt showed some pictures of the various instruments that we used in the validation study. So just one important note is that we conducted the validation on 3 different instruments, one being a colorimeter, as Matt mentioned. The second being an SL1000 that's made by Hach. They call it a portable parallel analyzer. Essentially, it's a colorimeter, but it automatically feeds the reagent and adjusts for temperature. And then finally, a spectrophotometer, which was, in this case, we used a DR6000. So for this first slide, I'm going to be talking about how we developed a standard curve for the spectrophotometer. So some spectrophotometers, such as the one we used, have built-in programs for analyzing monochloramine, and those use pre-programmed calibrations. And so we wanted to demonstrate that, any spectrophotometer that's capable of measuring absorbance at 655 nanometers could be used in the method. Just as an aside, the reason we use the 655 nanometer wavelength is because this is the absorbance peak for the indophenol compound formed between monochloramine and the monochlor-F reagents. So moving forward, whenever we're talking through this presentation about the spectrophotometer results, unless otherwise noted, these results are being reported using the standard curve, the calibration curve that you see here. So just a little bit about how we did this. We conducted this calibration of the standard curve in triplicate in both high and low ionic strength matrices. And so we dosed monochloramine at, you can see here on the plot, 0, 0.1, 0.5, 1, 2, and 4 milligrams per liter. And this is kind of the range of values that you would expect in a drinking water distribution system. And so given that we found no significant difference between the high and low ionic strength matrices, we pooled the data to give a more robust data set. And you can see that we had an R squared of almost 1. So we're pretty confident in that calibration. So next slide, Matt, please. So this experiment assessed the precision and accuracy of the draft monochloramine method. This figure shows, again, as I mentioned, it's showing recoveries for the 3 instruments that we tested. The blue, if you can't see the key, the blue is the colorimeter. The orange is the SO1000, that sort of automated colorimeter, and then the green is the spectrophotometer results. So for this experiment, series of experiments, we prepared monochloramine standards at 0.5 milligrams per liter, 2 and 3.5 milligrams per liter, again, both in high and low ionic strength matrices, and analyzed 4 aliquots of each prepared sample. And so we had sort of 2 QC bounds that we were looking for in this validation experiment. One is the precision of the method, and our tolerance is 20% there, and that's the relative standard deviation is presented in the error bars, and also the recovery. So that's kind of testing the accuracy, and our recovery limit there was plus minus 15%. So you can see that represented by the red bars in the plot. And as you can see, all trials were well within the quality control limits for precision and recovery. So, next slide. So the purpose of the matrix spike study was to compare the method's recovery in various drinking water matrices. And so in this figure, you're seeing recoveries again for each of the 3 instruments that we validated, and then for each drinking water matrix tested. And we collected treated drinking water samples from 4 different public water systems, 2 of which were supplied by surface water, those being the Greater Cincinnati Water Works in Falmouth, Kentucky, and 2 that were supplied by groundwater, those being Augusta, Kentucky, and Hamilton, Ohio. And again, the intent there is just to test different drinking water matrices to compare recovery of the method. One thing I will note here is that since these were treated drinking water samples, some of them did have chlorine residuals, and so it was important to ensure that chlorine residual had dissipated prior to spiking with monochloramine. And so we did that. We held these samples for 2 weeks in a cold room and verified that chlorine residual had decreased to 0 prior to spiking them with monochloramine. So each drinking water sample was spiked with monochloramine to a concentration of 2 milligrams per liter, and then we analyzed 3 aliquots of each spike sample using the method, and the experiment was performed in triplicate. So you're seeing the results of this matrix spike here. So we determined average % recovery, and it met all of the QC criterion, or the criteria. 30% plus minus on recovery, and then precision being the 20%. So you can see that presented in the error bars. So again, we didn't see any influence of different drinking water matrices on recovery for the method. Next slide. So the purpose of this pH study was to assess the influence of sample pH on the method, because water quality conditions, as Matt mentioned previously, such as pH and temperature, and the chlorine to nitrogen mass ratio are known to affect chloramine speciation. So essentially, we're assessing here the buffering capacity of the reagent over the range of pH levels that you would typically expect in a drinking water distribution system. And so we prepared samples of a known monochloramine concentration. We used 2 milligrams per liter, sort of in the midpoint of the calibration range, and analyzed pH at 7, 8, and 9. I'll note we adjusted pH with sodium hydroxide, and we analyzed both high and low ionic strength matrices here, and analyzed 3 aliquots of each prepared sample. and also conducted each experiment in triplicate. So you can see in the figure that over the range of, the typical expected pHs of water distribution systems from 7 to 9, all recoveries were within the quality control limit of 30%. So next slide, Matt. So interferences, the tables here I'm showing both known non-interfering and interfering substances and the respective levels that were tested. So for this study, we started with a list from the manufacturer's method and verified in the top table, we verified that those reported non-interfering substances did not indeed interfere. We selected concentrations that could be at the higher end of what you'd expect in drinking water and those commonly found in chlorinated drinking water systems. And so we evaluated monochloramine recoveries in prepared samples with each constituent in both high and low ionic strength matrices again, and analyzed 5 aliquots of each sample. I will note too that based on one of the papers that Matt cited earlier, the Lee and others in 2007, they determined that dichloramine and trichloramine also do not interfere with this indophenol method. So that's something important to note. And then finally, the bottom table, it lists interfering substances as reported by the manufacturer. So just noting here that these are reported by the manufacturer. Our task here for the interferences was just to ensure that those known non-interfering substances indeed do not interfere, at least at the levels that were tested, so anything less than what we tested. And we did not find any additional interfering substances. So next slide, Matt. So just a quick note here on sample hold time. We did a series of experiments to assess the holding time for the color stability. So again, this is a colorimetric method, so it relies on the formation of that indophenol color. And the manufacturer's method has noted that that color is stable for 15 minutes beyond the specified reaction time. So we verified that, and these experiments, we conducted this example here that you're seeing at room temperature in both high and low ionic strength matrices, and found that the color indeed is stable for at least 15 minutes after the specified reaction time. So next slide. So this is the next 2 slides. I'm going to talk about the sample reaction time findings that we had that Matt discussed earlier in his presentation. So the monochlor-F reagent reaction time is strongly influenced by the sample temperature. And so the purpose of this study was to assess the influence of the sample temperature on the reagent reaction time prior to analysis using this indophenol method. And so in this case, as I mentioned before, we were using a DR6000 spectrophotometer. For this experiment, we used the Thermo-Nicolet Evolution 300 that was equipped with a Peltier control and cooling unit. And this was to control sample temperature and continuously record absorbance at 30-second intervals at the peak absorbance at 655 nanometers. So we didn't use the DR6000 here because it didn't have the temperature controlling functionality. So that's just something to note. So the way we set this up, samples were dosed at monochloramine concentrations of 2 milligrams per liter. And then after reagent was added to each sample, we recorded the amount of time it took to mix and then to pour that into the cuvette. And then placed it into the spectrophotometer. And then absorbance, as I mentioned, absorbance was measured at 655 nanometers continuously at 30-second intervals until the sample reaction was complete. And we define that as when absorbance readings no longer increased after 5 consecutive readings of the same absorbance. And so reagent color development times were evaluated in triplicate at several temperatures. We evaluated at 5, 8, 10, 13, 15, 20, 25, and 30 degrees C in both high and low ionic strength matrices. And I'm depicting in this figure here, we're comparing what is reported by the commercial manufacturer of this method, the Hawk method, in the blue dots, and then our experimental data is depicted in the green dots. And so you can see that looking at them, there's the data that was generated by our validation study is an exponential, sort of an exponential function, whereas the Hawk data exhibited more of a linear. And we do have some theories as to why this discrepancy happened. I won't get into that here, but maybe we can in the question and answer period. So next slide. So these are the reagent color development times that we determined through experimentation. So to determine the appropriate reaction times from the experimental data that I showed in the previous slide, we took the 95% of the final absorbance value at 655 nanometers. And so this assumes a 5% error in determining reaction completion, which is, when you look at the literature, it's generally acceptable for this type of method. If you assume the reagent is in excess and the color formation is proportional to the reacted monochloramine by Beer's law, essentially, color formation can be represented as a pseudo first order reaction. And then assuming an Arrhenius relationship of the reaction rate constant, the natural log of the time to reach 95% of the various temperatures, it should be linearly related to the reciprocal of the sample temperature in Kelvin. And so, that's kind of a mouthful, but essentially the resulting regression line from that relationship was used to calculate the reaction times at these various temperatures that are shown. And are presented here. So to be conservative, I will note that the times that we're showing here are from the upper 95% confidence values from that linear regression. And the real takeaway here is that these findings are important, especially for temperatures less than 15 degrees C, because as you saw on the slide previously, much longer reaction times below 15 degrees C are needed compared to what is currently what's out there in practice. And so one thing I will note, especially at 5 degrees C, you can see that the sample reaction time is, is almost a half an hour. One thing that can be done that, we've kind of talked about as, Matt and I together is that reaction times can be speeded up. If you just hold the sample in your hand, being out in the field, that might be a difficult thing to do, have a sample react for half an hour, but pretty easily it can be warmed up, and so you can get in the lower reaction times fairly easily. And actually the SL1000, the portable parallel analyzer that I mentioned was one of the instruments that we used for the validation, actually does this automatically. It warms the sample, and so the reaction times is shorter for that. So these color development times really are for using the color emitters or the spectrophotometer if you're using the powdered reagent. So next slide. So I'm just going to go through a summary of the method performance and quality control requirements that we're putting in the method. So the first table summarizes method performance, and again, it's a little bit different for each instrument that was validated. The MDL was determined for each instrument using the procedure described in the CFR. So 7 aliquots of fortified lab blank. In this case, we used 0.1 milligrams per liter. Along with 7 reagent blanks were analyzed in both high and low ionic strength matrices, and that was conducted in triplicate on different days as specified in the procedure. So those are the MDLs that we found during our method validation and the relevant application range. Just a quick note here about sample collection. They will differ depending on what type of instrument you're using, so take note of that. And then finally, just a quick quality control summary. I have 2 columns here, one for initial quality control and then the other one for ongoing quality control. So initially running this method, if you are running and generating your own calibration curve for a spectrophotometer, you'll need to do instrument calibration. And then the next 2, precision and recovery and method detection limits are essentially part of the initial demonstration capability. So that's done. Both of those, the IPR and the MDL are done with each new analyst, essentially. And then moving over to the right-hand column, the ongoing quality control, So a calibration verification, and these are pretty standard for field methods like this, doing a quarterly quality control sample with a primary standard, and then performing a continuing calibration check with secondary standards with each instrument use. Lab reagent blanks should be done with each new reagent lot. And then finally, grab sample duplicates. Once per set samples on analysis day is the requirement there for this new method. So next slide. And then I'm not going to go through all the steps. I think most people that have conducted these colorimetric methods in the field are pretty familiar with how this works. I just have, as an example, the method procedure here listed for colorimeters. Again, the only main difference between this draft EPA method and the commercial method, the Hawk method, is the sample reaction time and paying special attention to the sample temperature prior to reagent addition. And again, this is and that's really for powdered reagent using a colorimeter or a spectrophotometer. The portable parallel analyzers adjust for sample temperature automatically. So I'm going to transition back now to Matt. He's going to talk about next steps for this method, and then I think we'll wrap up. So.
All right, thank you, Tom. So as Tom said, I'm just going to briefly wrap up our next steps here for this method. So the status of where we're at now, as I previously stated, we have developed the method. We have completed the primary and secondary validation studies. So those steps of the development process are complete. Where we're at now, the method's currently under review by EPA management. Ultimately, our goal is that this draft method will eventually become a published method, and it'll later become an approved method for use for regulatory water compliance and reporting programs. Approval of this method will provide primacy agencies and chloraminated public water systems an alternative method to quantify the concentration of the disinfectant that's effective of controlling pathogens in their distribution system. So we don't have any definitive timeline of when that's going to happen. This is just our hope of how this process will move along, but that's the status of where we're at now. We're hoping that it's more of a matter of months than matters of years, but that's kind of where we're hoping to head with this. So before we wrap things up, I'd also like to acknowledge some of the folks that have contributed to this. There's a list of individuals from EPA that have helped with the development of the method and just moving this method along. As I mentioned, we've completed the secondary validation study, so I'd like to thank individuals from the Louisville Water Company and Philadelphia Water Department for helping us with that. Then there's just a list of other individuals that have helped review the method. Last on the list is Scott Tucker from the Hawk Company. So as we found this discrepancy between our sample reaction times and then what the commercial manufacturer reported, we reached out to them and consulted with them just to get a better understanding of how they came up with their sample reaction times. Just to kind of compare notes and see what they did. And then last but not least, they're not mentioned on here, but Tom and I would like to thank our other team members, Rick Lieberman and Allison Dugan, just for their flexibility and support as we've been doing this project on the side in addition to our routine optimization team responsibilities. So with that concludes our presentation. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Greg.
Thank you. So I think moderators typically worry about whether their presenters are going to run overtime and whether there will be enough time for questions. In this case, we are actually running ahead of schedule, so we have plenty of time for questions. As we transition into answering questions, I'm going to ask the various presenters to take themselves off mute and open up their cameras. Victoria, I know that you had some camera issues, so we won't be seeing you, but if all of you can take yourselves off mute and be prepared for questions, we'll move into that in a minute. I will just note too that we still have 2 sets of sessions left in the workshop. Sessions 8A and 8B begin at 2 o'clock Eastern, and 9A and 9B begin at 4:30 Eastern. So I will go ahead and move into to addressing a number of questions to our presenters, and I'm going to start with Chris. I'll paraphrase on most of these questions, and the first one is, why the preference, why the interest in performing isotope dilution with methods?
I think a lot of this is driven, at least for the Clean Water Act method that we're working on with, that applies isotope dilution to non-drinking water matrices, is in deference to our Department of Defense colleagues. They feel very strongly about including isotope dilution in their calculations for their sites. And I don't have an opinion one way or the other personally, but I think one of the big advantages of using isotope dilution is that you can really, I think, handle some very ugly, nasty matrices, things like landfill leachate, with isotope dilution, and tracking those isotopes to recalculate or calculate your final concentrations to help you address some of the absorption issues in particular.
Thank you. Be to the next question in 1 minute. So the next one I'll put to Tom. It's asking if the monochloramine method will be used online for process control.
At this point, it's we didn't envision it or validate it for online continuous monitors. What we validated were grab sample for color emitters and spectrophotometers. So and Greg, I guess I'd defer to you as to whether or not that would require separate validation if it's an online monitor or not, but I would assume so.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't have a clear answer to that. I know that for most of the parameters, and this would be, well, for most of the parameters, we require compliance monitoring samples to be analyzed by a certified laboratory. I think with some parameters, there's more flexibility, but I'm probably reaching to try to answer that one in more detail. So I'm going to move to Victoria with a question. I know, Victoria, you mentioned the New York MCL of 10 ppt, and the question is whether that is for individually for PFO and PFOS, or for the sum of PFO and PFOS.
So it hasn't been, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it hasn't been published yet. Comment period just finished, and he announced it in July, but it will be individual. But there were comments about doing that, but to date, it's going to be individual.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, this next question is a long one. I'll try to paraphrase as I go, but asking about the feasibility of using separate columns to multitask PFAS LC-based instrumentation, assuming a multi-column LC design, and it points to a number of examples. Is that enough for you to try to field that question?
Yeah, I guess sort of. I mean, as I mentioned, for the method that we're validating right now for non-drinking water matrices under the Clean Water Act protocols, we hope to allow flexibility on both elution and column schemes. So it really, I think it's going to depend on what the final outcome of the method is, and what the modifications that will be allowable that are written into the method, the scope of those modifications, and I just don't know the answer to that yet. But if the method is validated, both single and multi-lab validated, and modifications on columns and elution schemes are put in there such that that would allow the analysts to do that, then then yeah, it should be okay.
Okay, and this next one is also for you, Chris, asking how the results from TOF analyses might be used.
Yeah, that's a good question. We get that a lot. One of the criticisms of TOF is that it may not be, well, it probably won't be nearly as sensitive as many of the targeted methods. And if that's the case, we'll push that sensitivity as low as we can go as we develop the method. But it may be that the real application of things like TOF, total organic fluorine, or some people call it absorbable organic fluorine analyses, are really for site screening. And so if there's suspected contamination, for example, at a groundwater, at a state or a Superfund site or something like that, then perhaps TOF can be applied initially to try to get a better picture of what's there in total. And then if you have that, that can help you adjust what your dilution rates might need to be for more targeted analyses. So at this point, depending on how low we can push that sensitivity, we're looking at this as really a screening tool.
Thanks. I'll put this next one to Matthew, and they're asking if the monochloramine method will include requirements for initial demonstration of capability for an analyst.
Yes, it will. And that was one of the reasons we pursued the EPA. We as EPA pursued the development of the method ourselves, so we could include those type of QA/QC requirements into the method. So yes, that is a requirement.
And I would say that it's almost universal for the EPA published methods. So
and that would be for compliance samples, right? I mean, if they're doing investigative sampling outside of reporting for compliance, you know, this method is an option, but it wouldn't be required. But for compliance samples, I think that would be the case.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. Yeah, when people will often come to us asking about using a method for an application not related to compliance monitoring, and really, I guess the short answer to that is anything goes when it comes to using a method for process control or for voluntary monitoring, something that's not required for compliance monitoring. So I'll go back to Victoria with this next question. So it says, in the presentation, you mentioned that you don't suggest labs be certified for the ISO method because it's obsolete. The question is asking what makes the method obsolete.
I wouldn't say it's obsolete. It's not a well-defined method in the sense that it doesn't have, it's not as explicit as having what we call the 23 points of a method. So it's not as detailed as, say, an EPA method or a standard method would be, or other consensus organization methods where we can hold labs to it, you know, almost line by line. So in New York, we're pretty strict. If it's an EPA, must follow it as is, where the ISO was more for interpretation.
Okay, thank you. So back to Chris with this next one. It's asking what concentration of inorganic fluoride is problematic for the TOF method, and is TOF a good substitute or a good substitution method for wastewater analysis?
The short answer is we don't know yet. So that is one of the issues that we're going to be dealing with during the development. And we were just getting things off of the ground when the pandemic hit. But looking at where fluorine, inorganic fluorine, becomes problematic is obviously a top priority for the development of that method. And what was the second part again, Greg?
I missed that part, or I think I've already deleted that from my view. So if any of the others have that, and you can retrieve that. Tom, do you happen to have it? Tom Speth? Okay, we'll come back to that.
Yeah, I believe it was is it useful as a wastewater method?
Oh, right. Thanks, Tom. We don't know yet. We don't know what matrices are going to be amenable to this. That's going to be a part of the development process.
Next question I'll put to Tom Waters or Matthew Alexander. And it's asking how methods will be developed to differentiate between free, mono, di, tri, and organochloramine.
I can take a stab at that first, Tom. So in terms of methods that specifically differentiate between those components, a few years ago did approve the Hawk indophenol free chlorine method, which specifically measures free chlorine, like PPD methods, which are prone to interferences from other oxidants. That's one colorimetric method out there that is currently available. Hoping that the monochloramine method will be approved, that will specifically measure monochloramine. Unfortunately, there's not great field methods that I'm aware of that can differentiate between di and organochloramines. Or in a lab, I know that there's the membrane induction mass spectrometry method, which can differentiate the different species of chloramine, though that's pretty expensive to run and it has to be performed in a lab, a pretty advanced lab. In terms of colorimetric methods, there's nothing horizon that I'm aware of right now. So.
Thanks. So in my moderator role, I'm trying to do my best to spread the questions around, but I will say that, Chris, you probably have the honor of drawing the most questions. So I'll come back to you with another question. This one says, it was mentioned that ORD has a research method for marine water analysis of PFAS. Is it possible to share? Is there a plan to have an official EPA method released soon?
First of all, possible to share, please refer to the link at the bottom of the slide. You should have a copy of those slides. And right now, as far as method validations, marine waters is not at the top of the list for us right now. We've got to get through this this Clean Water Act method validation process. So we may be looking at a validation process later on down the road, but I would say certainly not within a year for a formal validation process for marine waters.
And I think for any of these questions related to the presentation on the monochloramine method, I'm just going to put it out there, and I'll invite Tom or Matthew to jump in, whichever one of you feels like you want to answer it. So for the monochloramine method, it says waiting 15 minutes for reaction time in the field appears long. As long as the standard curve and samples are handled in the same procedure, can the reaction time be shortened?
I'll try to answer this, Matt, since you did the last one. I would say no. I mean, the method is pretty sensitive to sample temperature, especially down at, I mean, a 15-minute reaction time would be about, you'd be at around 10 degrees Celsius. So I think a way to get around that would be to sample up prior to adding reagent. I will say through the validation process, we even in a controlled laboratory environment, we had a difficult time, especially down at the colder temperatures, and maintaining the sample temperature. Even in a controlled environment. So we went through several iterations about how to do that, and we ended up arriving on the the Peltier unit inside the spectrophotometer. So for field samples to be at that cold temperatures, I think that would be the exception. So, I think most people will be operating around, room temperature, 15 degrees C, somewhere in that range. But if you are out in the field sampling, it's very cold. If you're, down around, especially less than 15 degrees Celsius, you know, I think even just handling the sample is going to warm it up a little bit. So that's, I mean, that's why we're saying to, you know, measure sample temperature just prior to reagent addition, because, you know, even handling during, you know, our experiments, we were finding that we were warming them up. So, you know, that's one way to kind of get around those long reaction times with especially cold water. Matt, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, just to add, because you're dealing with such a small volume, if you're using a colorimeter, it's 10 mils. If it's a spec, it's even less than that. So it really doesn't take long to warm up that sample, holding it in your hand. So, you know,
I guess bottom line is that if you don't allow for enough reaction time, you're likely to underestimate. You're likely to end up with a low bias in your monochloramine measurement.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will, if anyone's interested in that, we have a paper in review right now on this specific issue. So that hopefully, you know, in the next couple of months, that'll be coming out.
Okay. I'm going to try this next question with Victoria, and feel free to say if you don't have the information, but they're asking about the cost for the analysis of a finished water sample for PFAS by an accredited lab. Do you happen to know?
I don't know, like, the cost analysis amount. I could say it is expensive just based on the technology utilized. It's not running a colorimetric method, but I don't know the cost. We haven't surveyed our labs.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you know, the degree of PFAS monitoring varies state to state. I think there's definitely high interest in PFAS, but I feel like the commercial laboratory market for PFAS analysis probably still developing to a degree. So you know, there's probably not there's probably a range of costs across laboratories, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's by demand and like the project. I mean, they could have it based on a project, and I tell you that, you know, back when PCBs were a hot topic and the dioxins and furans, those were in the $100 range for analysis.
Thank you. Chris, this question is asking if a draft copy of the Clean Water Act Method 1600 is available for review.
It is not, however, it's not unprecedented. I apologize for the double negative. That a draft can be posted after a single lab validation, a successful single lab validation. So that is totally up to the reviewers in the Office of Water. If the single lab validation data look good and they are given the green light, they can post that as a draft method while the multi-lab validation takes place.
And this question for Victoria is asking about requirements for subpart section 55-2.5 and whether you can explain that section further.
Yeah, it's pretty much what it is recognition of a laboratory developed method. So right now, you know, we hold a lab to EPA method, say 537.1 or 5, but the lab wants to do its own slight modifications. Maybe it is changing the column, even a little bit of the extraction method. So they would have to go through a comparability study. So they would run samples as is by the approved method, and then their lab developed method, and they would have to show us the differences between the two methods. So it's a crosswalk, and then run samples, you know, side by side through their extraction method if needed, as well as the determinant method, and ensure that the recovery are in sync, the QC limits are met for the method. And if they don't, then the method is not considered better.
Okay, Chris, this one is asking if you can use F-19 NMR for screening and quantitation for PFAS.
Yeah, I believe there's been a fair amount of studies looking at NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance units, to analyze for PFAS. The issue for us is that NMR units are not widely available to commercial labs and state laboratories across the United States. So typically, if we look at a method for anything, even though there may be some good evidence for NMR that it's a good method to use, because of the cost and the occurrence, or the fact that the units are not widely used in commercial labs, we typically don't work on method validations for NMR.
And this next one is back on the monochloramine method. It's asking, what is the maximum holding time for a sample before an accurate total chloramine concentration can be determined by the conventional DPD total chlorine method?
I can answer, Tom. With the DPD total chlorine method, it's recommended to analyze samples immediately, just because, especially once the sample is collected and transferred to the atmosphere. I'd like to clarify too, just any potential misunderstanding with our presentation. Tom talked about the sample hold time experiment where we held the sample. That was after we added the reagent to the sample though. So the reaction with the monochloramine with the monochlorif reagent had taken place. And that was just to demonstrate that color formation was stable over a 15-minute period. That wasn't prior to the reagent being added. With any disinfectant analysis, it's good to analyze immediately in terms of adding the reagent to the sample.
Matt, for total chlorine, it's immediate analysis, or is that the 3-minute reaction time? DPD.
Okay, so yeah, just to clarify the term analysis is starting the method, so that's adding the reagent.
Yep.
There is a reaction time though for the total chlorine before you measure the absorbance. So that's good, Tom.
Okay, back to Chris on PFAS. They're asking if the direct aqueous injection LC-MS-MS method requires inline solid phase extraction, and asking about detection limits and matrix limitations.
No, it does not require inline concentration. However, Toby Sannon and some of the other chemists in the Office of Research and Development have done some pretty good work that look at what, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, we'd still have to call it a research grade method, but they have a published paper on inline concentration for PFAS. So that's something we hope to add to the analytics website that I mentioned. There's a link in the slides for it. And so hopefully that'll be up. And if there's interest in looking at inline concentration, you can look at that paper. But the method itself, the direct injection method, was not validated for inline.
Okay, and I'm trying to go back to part 2 of that question. It's asking about detection limits and matrix limitations.
Detection limits for the direct injection, as I mentioned, the target during the validation was 10 nanograms per liter for each compound or less. Some compounds run better than others. One of the most problematic for the direct injection method, but I would argue one of the most problematic for any method, is the 6,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. There's issues that we think are going on in the MS and the ionization of that compound, but we've also seen several instances of contamination issues, usually in laboratory contamination issues, not field sampling issues. You know, I think for any compound though, in any of these methods we're talking about, we're at single nanogram per liter ranges, and this is very, very low. So, you know, contamination issues are a constant issue, both in the field and in the laboratory. So as I also mentioned, the latest and the greatest instrumentation can really help get those detection limit issues down for direct injection. Some of the developments with ionization in mass spectrometers that have happened over the past year or two can really get you at a lower level for that direct injection method.
Thank you. So back to talking about monochloramine measurements, and I'm going to break this up into a couple parts. I'll start with, does the Hawk monochlor F method only measure inorganic chloramines?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and then part two, so as long as the total chlorine and monochloramine residuals are approximately equal, is it safe to assume that there are no organochloramines?
Yeah, I think that's an option. It's safe to assume there's no chloramines or other interferences, because as I mentioned with the total method, things like oxidized manganese can also interfere with that as well. It's safe to say there's no interferences.
And I'll be honest, as I'm asking this next question, I can't remember if we've had a similar question already or not. Chris, they're asking if SW846 method 8327 is considered a standard method or a research method.
SW846 methods across the board, with some exceptions, are considered guidance by the Office of Land and Emergency Management. So they're within the groups of EPA methods. This is guidance. Some of the exceptions in SW846 are where methods have been codified or they're part of a regulation. A good example of that is the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. But at this point, 8327 should be considered a guidance method.
And then the next part of the question, I'm going to ask if Victoria or Chris have perspective on it. They're asking if there are any certifications that labs should be acquiring to validate their ability to perform that method 8327, and drinking water methods 537.1 and 533. I've got a few thoughts on that, but I'll let Victoria and Chris speak first.
So I'll speak for New York State. We haven't brought on certification for analysis in soils or, ambient or non-potable waters at this time, because the whole focus was drinking water. But for any lab, I have an application I received today. In order for them to demonstrate getting certification EPA 537.1, which they applied for, they provide us, one, their SOP, two, their initial demonstration of capability, which is essentially running at least 4 lab control samples through the method and having those samples meet the QC requirements specified in the method. At the same time, all labs must submit a method detection limit study that includes both measuring spikes as well as blanks, as was specified in 40 CFR 136 a few years ago. So that is what gets a lab into our program, submitting that material. And if the lab already has that existing technology, we do not perform any virtual or on-site audit. If they don't have that technology brand new to them, then we will perform an audit.
So I suspect that the position on a laboratory becoming certified to analyze for PFAS is going to vary state to state. From a federal perspective, and looking at drinking water, since there is currently no federal requirement for PFAS monitoring, there isn't a federal requirement for certification of labs for drinking water analyses. I think that a lot of you are aware that PFAS are among the contaminants being considered for the next round of unregulated contaminant monitoring under UCMR 5. And if we were to include PFAS in UCMR 5, the laboratories that analyze those samples would have to be approved by EPA to support that monitoring. So, Chris, do you have anything you want to add on that or on the SW846 method?
No, just real quickly, if you go to that website, we do have a section on laboratory certification that provides some links to some certification processes. So one, for example, is DoD's certification process through their DNIX web portal. And there is a link to get there from that Analytical Methods website.
And then
this is Victoria again.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we are part of a national laboratory accreditation program called the NELAC Institute, and we're one of, I want to say, 16 states in this national program, along with New York certification for these two parameters. I know we will recognize what New Jersey does for certification of water for the parameters, as well as New Hampshire and Florida. So it saves us as a state from traveling to a lab that's located in South Carolina because Florida has audited them. So the states are regulating it, and that allows us to do recognition with others.
Thank you. Yeah, you covered exactly what I was going to about the NELAB programs across multiple states. In the drinking water realm, in addition to those states that operate NELAB programs, there are states that have traditional drinking water laboratory certification programs, and state by state, they can choose to certify labs for PFAS measurement, even in the absence of a federal requirement for that. So Chris, I'll come back to you with a question about TOF, and they're asking if there are any thoughts given to running samples by two analytical methods, one to measure TOF and the other to measure inorganic fluoride for background subtraction.
Yeah, I think that's something we might consider. I think no matter how we do it, that separation of the organic related or the organically bound fluorine and the inorganic is going to be difficult.
Thanks. So Matt and Tom, this next question is asking what it means when my field kit always reports 2.2 milligrams per liter.
So that probably means you're using a low range method, and the actual residual or disinfectant residual is greater than the maximum detection of that method. So with just specifically talking about the Hawk methods with their field colorimeter, for the low range method, the maximum reportable range is 2 milligrams per liter, but the colorimeter will actually report up to 2.2. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you a light that says over range all the time necessarily, depending on what model of colorimeter you're using. So you're likely to have a higher residual there than what your method can measure.
And I guess this next point is more just a note as opposed to a question, and it goes back to the earlier point about the cost of PFAS analyses. It says that in Michigan, they're seeing prices for PFAS in drinking water of less than $300 per sample. I'm just looking to see if I have missed any questions that might have come in the past few minutes. I'll take just a minute to scroll the questions before we close out the session. I see we have about 8 minutes left, so we're approaching the end anyway. And for those of you who have asked questions, I think I realize there are a number of questions that we haven't attempted to answer today. In a handful of cases, we looked at them and used our judgment and thought that that today's presenters are probably not in a good position to answer those questions. So we do have the questions, we do have the person who raised the question, and we'll do our best to follow up with you and get and answer those, maybe involving some others after today's session. So I have looked and I do not see any others. Do any of the presenters have any parting questions or comments among yourselves? Okay.
Hey, Greg, this is Chris. I did see a couple come in, and I can address them really quickly. One had to do with PFBA is a common trace method contaminant due to its use in chromatography. As I mentioned before, we're at really, really low levels. So any of these compounds, and some are, like I mentioned before, for 6,2-fluoroethylamine sulfonate, some are more problematic than others. But PFBA can be a contaminant that's found in the analyses, and that's why we stress in any method that you use, make sure you have good QA/QC in place for both the sampling, transport to the lab, and while you're in the laboratory as well. Because really, regardless of what specific compound we're talking about, having that QA/QC in place really is important for tracking where you might be picking something up, whether it's in the field, whether it's in a reagent, whether it's somewhere in your instrument, or whether it's a pipette tip, whatever. And then the other one is, there was a question about PFAS analysis in desalinated water. Desalinated water will not be one of the matrices that we're looking at for the isotope dilution method, the isotope dilution validation. However, desalinated water is going to be a relatively clean matrix. So I would have a lot of confidence that we develop a method that will work for, say, wastewater influent. Desalinated water should be a piece of cake.
I see it's about 5 minutes before 1. The session was due to end at 1. Maybe before we close out completely, I'll just see if there's any other business to cover. And actually, I guess at this point, we don't have anything else. I'll just use the opportunity to thank the 500 or 600 of you who joined us for today's presentations, and also to thank our speakers. As I mentioned before, there are still 2 sets of sessions left this afternoon, so we hope you can join us for those, and hope that you can return next year to join us for the 18th annual workshop. We'll see whether that's also virtual or whether that's an in-person event, so time will tell. But thank you again.